After Clause 42, Amendment 106. Lord Moylan.
Thank you. My Lords, I rise to speak to amendments number 106, 326 and 330 in my name. In doing so, may I offer the apologies, I've been requested to offer the apologies of the noble Lord MacDonald of River Glaven, who wished very much to speak on this, whose name is on the list of supporters, but who is not able to be here because of professional obligations. In these amendments, 326 and 330 are essentially minor consequential amendments. The meat, if you like, of the amendment of the debate is in amendment number 106. My Lords, these amendments concern non-crime hate incidents. They are a subject of controversy and much debated, but I hope to persuade your Lordship's House that this particular amendment largely is not actually controversial because it is essentially procedural in character and doesn't change current practice for recording those crimes in itself. Now, with so many distinguished lawyers having indicated they wish to speak in this debate, I hesitate to start by giving a brief summary of the legal background, but I shall do so very tentatively and subject to their correction, if I may. A hate crime, my Lords, is a crime, it may be in principle any crime, which is conjoined with a motivation on the part of the perpetrator of hatred towards a particular or specified group. That hatred needs to be perceived either by the victim or by one of a number of other groups of people acting reasonably, for example, a witness such as a police constable or whatever. But what happens? It is an alloy, if you like, of a crime and a motivation. But what happens if one part of that alloy is missing? If there is evidence of a motivation of hate, but there is actually no crime, no action which constitutes a crime or which meets the threshold for bringing a prosecution. That, my Lord, is the essence of the non-crime hate incident, the hated incident which occurs without being conjoined with a crime. Now, these non-crime hate incidents are often recorded by the police, and if the perpetrator is known, they are recorded, so to speak, against the name of the perpetrator. They go to a record in the name of that person. All of this happens at the moment, my Lords, under guidance issued by the College of Policing. It's quite extensive and elaborate guidance, if you choose to look it up. But it has no statutory force. It has no democratic supervision, and it is inconsistently applied as between different police forces. I think most noble lords would agree that this is not a satisfactory position, and the bulk of this amendment, all of it apart from one subclause which I shall come to shortly, effectively obliges the Home Secretary to issue guidance within 6 months of the passage of the bill, to issue guidance and to take account of certain matters in doing so, one of which is the human right to freedom of expression. It does not tell her what the guidance she issues should contain. It does not prevent her from adopting the existing guidance wholesale, should she wish to do so. But it does bring the whole matter under political oversight for the first time, and because it is proposed that this should be done through a statutory instrument made under the affirmative procedure, it brings it to the attention and available for the comment of both Houses of Parliament. So democratic accountability will be brought to this process for the first time, and I think that can only be widely welcomed by members of this House. What this amendment does not do explicitly is it does not affect police practice in relation to any police investigation which is current. And it does not apply to any police action in relation to hatred expressed towards an individual, as opposed to hatred motivated by hatred of a group. So, if there were cases of stalking and things of that character directed at an individual, that would not be covered, not be caught by this amendment. Now, that deals with the bulk of the amendment, all of the clauses, all of the parts of it, except subclause 7. So I'm going to come to that separately because it's slightly different. Subclause 7 prohibits the police from including this data, if they have recorded it, when responding to requests for an enhanced criminal record check. As I say, it has a slightly different character to the rest of the amendment, but it does address what I perceive, and many others perceive, as an injustice. Now, other noble lords may speak later, giving instances of that injustice by referring to particular cases. But I would just like to address what I regard as the principle of the injustice, which is that if you are accused of a crime, you have the opportunity to state your case and protest your innocence in an open court in front of an impartial judge and heard by a jury. That is not the case if you have a non-crime hate incident recorded against your name. There is no process in which those who feel themselves, believe themselves to be innocent of that allegation, there is no process they can pursue to clear their name, apart from judicial review, which, as we know, is an expensive and arduous process and not available to most people. And this can attach a stigma to their name that will last potentially for the rest of their life. They will be stigmatized for many years for not committing a crime. Now, that seems to me, my lords, to be a real and serious injustice, but it's not merely abstract. As other noble lords may explain, there are particular cases which illustrate it. Now, given that this is, in my view, a largely procedural amendment, that it adds democratic accountability to a process, I would hope it would find support on all sides of the House and indeed from the government. And so, my lords, I beg to move.
My lords, Amendment 106. Insert the following new clause as printed on the marshalled list.
My lords, it's a privilege to follow and support the speech of my noble lord, the noble lord, Lord Moylan. If this speech is a little bit longer than I originally intended, it's to cover some of the ground that I understand would have been covered by the noble lord, Lord MacDonald of River Gloven. Making non-crime hate records has real-life consequences for an individual, which are too important to be left unregulated. By definition, as we've heard, non-crime hate records are kept when no crime has been committed, but the police decide they have grounds for concern about how that person might behave in the future. Once such a record is made, it can remain forever without review. It will be disclosed on an enhanced criminal records request. It does not take George Orwell to show where that can lead. I suggest Sir Robert Peel would have been astonished. Let me turn to the real-life case of Harry Miller of Lincolnshire. In 2018 and 19, Harry Miller posted tweets about transgender issues on Twitter. He holds gender-critical views, but denies being prejudiced against transgender people. And I'm quoting here from the judgment in the subsequent judicial review. He regards himself as taking part in the ongoing debate about reform of the law. Mrs. B, a transgender woman, read the tweets. She regarded them as transphobic. She reported them to Humberside Police, who recorded this as a non-crime hate incident. She was the only person to complain. A police officer visited Mr. Miller at work to speak to him in his workplace about these tweets. He left Mr. Miller with the impression that he might be prosecuted if he continued such tweeting. In a subsequent press statement, an assistant chief constable raised the possibility of possible criminal proceedings if matters escalated. Imagine how that felt, what that felt like for Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller, however, applied for judicial review. Mr. Justice Julian Knowles, in a very fine and lengthy judgment, found that the police's actions towards Mr. Miller disproportionately interfered with his right of freedom of expression. He reminded us that free speech is an essential component of democracy. He reminded us of these words in the unpublished introduction to Animal Farm. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. As the judge stressed, true free speech includes the irritating, the contentious, the eccentric, the heretical, the unwelcome, and the provocative. On the facts, the judge concluded that the tweets were lawful and there was not the slightest risk that Mr. Miller would commit a criminal offence by continuing to tweet. That is the judgment in the High Court. Further, he said, the police visit to the police place of work, coupled with the subsequent press statement, combined to create a disproportionate interference with Mr. Miller's right of freedom of expression. He found that had a potential chilling effect. Going forward, therefore, the police should not continue to record non-criminal speech without proper oversight, and that's what we ask. There must be clear criteria applied by all police forces uniformly. At present, the College of Policing lays down guidelines, but they are no more than guidelines. A police force is free, in principle, to depart from the guidelines. Indeed, the current guidelines state in these terms, and I quote, "The recording system for local recording of non-crime hate incidents varies according to local force policy." That is not acceptable, my lords. These records, by definition, are of a non-crime. They are subject to no time limits. The guidelines do not provide for mandatory periodical review, whether after 1 year, 5 years, or 20 years. This is too important to be left to varying and uncertain police practice. Policy and practice in this field cannot properly be left to the wide discretion of different police forces. It should be for the Secretary of State, answerable to Parliament, to decide when, if at all, and in what circumstances and how such records may be made and kept. A person's reputation is of inestimable value. If a confidential record is made that he or she has spoken or behaved in a way which someone else has perceived to be motivated by hostility, but which does not amount to a crime, that individual becomes a marked man or woman when a request is made by a current or prospective employer for an enhanced disclosure and barring service check. As matters stand, that mark or stain can remain forever. So what is at stake is very serious. This amendment will ensure that regulations set a definitive framework to ensure fairness, to ensure a consistent and fair process of selecting and recording personal data, identifying the different categories of personal data and its processing, identifying the persons whose authority is required for such processing, ensuring they are of suitable rank, the notification of the individual and the data subject, who is the data subject, how long the data may be retained, and with what reviews. If someone's to be denied employment, we must be confident that the basis for this is sound and properly managed. And you've heard from my noble friend that the provisions will not apply to the processing of information pursuant to ongoing criminal investigation, nor will they apply for the purposes of administrative functions of the police authority. There will be no interference with operational policing. So these amendments are needed to ensure that freedom of speech and opinion is not subjected, as the European Court has said, to the heckler's veto, and to create a proper balance between public safety, freedom of speech and protection of reputation. Thank you.
My Lords, I've added my name to these amendments. It's a great pleasure to follow the noble Lords Moylan and Sandhurst. In the light of their comprehensive description of the purpose of these amendments, I can be brief. Much of the data with which these amendments are concerned relate to freedom of expression. Views are expressed, opinions are stated which offend other people, which annoy others, but which do not constitute criminal offences. The views, the opinions may relate to religion, to transgender issues, Brexit, or a whole range of other sensitive and controversial questions. Sadly, many people have lost the willingness to discuss and to debate, to say, I disagree with what you say, but I will defend your right to say it. In today's world, a more typical reaction to opinions with which you disagree is to take offence, to demand a safe space, to complain that your identity has been challenged, that your truth has been denied. Even though no crime has been committed, the police are asked to record the grievance and to retain the data. I agree with my noble friends that for the police to have unregulated power, that's what it is, unregulated power, to retain and use data about such exercises of free speech deters the vigorous debate and discussion on which a free society thrives. Now, it may be appropriate in some circumstances for such data to be retained and to be used. None of us are disputing that. But that should be according to law, authorised by Parliament, and not just by the discretion of police authorities who choose to apply or not to apply guidance from the College of Policing. So I hope that the Minister will consider these amendments constructively and that she will be able to give them her support, the government's support, whether in a revised version or otherwise, at report stage.
My Lord, may I rise to say that I strongly support this new clause, and I give all the support that I can to it. I think the arguments put forward by my noble friends are frankly unarguable against. There are three propositions which I think are affronted by this particular notification of non-crime hate incidents. The first is the chilling effect on free speech, and the noble Lord Panic illustrated that very clearly. One has to be assertive of the right to express one's views without the risk of having this notification made against one. And secondly, one has to recognise too that these are very long-standing notifications which can have a very seriously prejudicial impact on individuals, and that is thoroughly undesirable, especially if the individual has no right of appeal or an effective way of challenging. Judicial review for most people is not an effective way of challenging. And then also the point made by all noble lords who've spoken so far, there is no statutory guidance. It is local police policy which influences the way these notifications are made. And that is inherently unjust, having regard to the impact that it could have. My final point is this: I welcome very much that the regulations are to be made by the affirmative procedure. But as I have said in this House and elsewhere on many occasions, whilst that is a good thing in the sense that the comments made by your lordships and by those in the other place can be heeded, we don't have the power to amend the statutory instrument. And I have long argued that this House, of Parliament in general, should have the power to amend the contents of statutory instruments. And this is rather a good example of where that would be beneficial.
My Lords, my Lords, I want to enthusiastically endorse these amendments and thank the noble Lords Moylan, Pannick, MacDonald and Sandhurst for raising this crucial issue. This issue of non-crime hate incidents has been of concern to a number of us for some years, and it's good that at last it's getting some parliamentary attention. I'd like to particularly credit those organisations and publications that have persistently raised this in the public realm and whose research informs my remarks, especially the Free Speech Union, of which I'm on the Advisory Council, the anti-racist campaign Don't Divide Us, and Spiked Online. As an issue, though, it's one that too many avoid because it is rather tricky and contentious. And one of the reasons it's difficult to raise is because nobody wants to look as though they're being soft on hate incidents. But I'm concerned that this has led to itself a degree of chilling self-censorship and allowed some confusion to arise between what is a crime and what's not a crime when the police are involved. Instinctively, when the public hear the phrase hate or hate crime or hate incident, we think of, for example, someone being beaten up because of their skin colour and we're appalled, or we think, for example, of someone being harassed in the street because they're gay and we're shocked, and we assume the worst kind of bigotry, and our instinct is that something must be done. But it's actually not so clear-cut. According even to the hate crime operational guidance issued by the College of Policing, hate crime is often an entirely subjective category itself, based on the perception of the alleged victim, and I'll come back to this. But what's extraordinary about the guidance on hate crime is that what the police consider to be successfully tackling hate crime, the guidance says this. It says, targets that see success as reducing hate crime are not appropriate, which just completely befuddled me. But rather, the police measure, they say, that their success is by increasing the opportunities for victims to report. But I fear that in this act of enthusiasm to get more people to report hate, the police have been muddying any clear distinction between what is criminal and what is not. The focus on reporting initiatives has led earlier this year to rainbow-coloured hate crime police cars patrolling local areas with the aim of giving communities the confidence to come forward and report hate crime. However well-meaning, such awareness-raising initiatives often encourage people to come forward and report things that aren't crimes at all. In fact, earlier this year, a police digital ad van trawled around the Wirral, warning that, quote, being offensive is an offence. But actually, being offensive is not a criminal offence. After a backlash, local police clarified that this was an error. But why did the police get this so wrong in terms of what is a crime? And this isn't an isolated incident. A few years ago, Greater Glasgow Police tweeted an ominous warning, "Think before you post, or you may receive a visit from us this weekend." And they posted that alongside a graphic that warned social media users to consider if their tweets were true, hurtful, unkind, necessary, and then right at the end, illegal. Then there was the South Yorkshire Police Hate Hurts campaign that asked people to report any, quote, offensive or insulting social media posts to police officers. My lords, none of these are crimes, and I think that in a bill named the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, it is a concern if the police don't know what is or isn't a crime when it comes to hate. So much so that Cheshire Police recently admitted to conflating crime and non-crime in its hate crime statistics. So this amendment can potentially start unpicking this muddle, because I think the source of the confusion of what's a crime or not lies in the creation of the category non-crime hate incident. As we've heard, a category that was established by the College of Policing. And its guidance actually encourages police officers, I think, to overreach and police non-crimes. I think it's worth telling, my lords, how this is posed in the guidance. The NCHI's guidance states, when it is established that a criminal offence has not taken place, but the victim or any other person perceives that the incident was motivated wholly or partly by hostility, it should be recorded and flagged as a non-crime hate incident. Note that use of the word victim used to describe the reporter or accuser, when there's no evidence existing that any crime has been perpetrated against him or her. And the victim only has to claim that some action or speech was motivated wholly or partly by hostility. Hostility itself, a very vague and subjective term. The victim, and I quote, and listen to this, does not have to justify or provide evidence of their belief for the purpose of reporting, and police officers or staff should not directly challenge perception. Furthermore, this can be the basis for any other person's perception, so even further removed from any real incident, let alone crime. Finally, the guidance notes that, quote, police officers may also identify a non-crime hate incident even when the victim or others do not. Why? Because victims may not be aware that they are the victim of a non-crime hate incident, even though it's clear to others. I'm afraid I do find this a kind of dystopian Orwellian nightmare world. And for this, untangling your way through that, your name, unbeknown to you, can appear on a database intended for recording details of criminal offences and subject to checks by vetting officers when people apply for jobs, as we've heard from the noble lords. My lords, I hope you can see the dangers here. Because of the subjective nature of the NCHI guidelines, there's a real possibility of abuse of the system by people acting in bad faith. The NCHI guidance means that unfounded, spurious and malicious reports can be filed and never tested, let alone the fact that this data gathering is a distraction for the police from pursuing real criminals. I was contacted by one person ahead of this debate who said, I had a visit from the police because a member of staff offended another member of staff who works for me. No crime reported. The police spoke to me for 40 minutes. In the meantime, the 200 pallets that I reported stolen the week before didn't generate a phone call or a visit. And then there is the chilling effect of NCIH's on free speech, as so vividly spelt out by other noble lords. But NCHIs can act as a threat, a kind of surveillance of free speech for people who will say these will eventually lead to crime. And anyone who is following the fate of gender-critical feminists at the moment, constantly accused of hate by a particular brand of trans activists, will understand just how damaging that is to free speech. I know that this government tell us all the time that they are keen to oppose cancel culture. And I fear that inadvertently, these NCHIs contribute to that very censorious climate of denunciation, the very toxic climate of hate that we're all keen to combat. I therefore urge the government to consider these amendments carefully and remove this contradictory anomaly, which I fear brings the police and the criminal law into disrepute.
My lords, we're all so polite. I wasn't actually going to speak on this because there are much bigger issues coming up later. But I had seen this in a completely reverse way because I think probably it's not completely clear whether this amendment is trying to help or hinder the collection and retention of data if you don't have a QC's training or legal training of any sort. Because to me it seems like a good opportunity to talk about misogyny and other abusive behaviour that falls short of a criminal offence and nonetheless should be recorded on a person's police record. The biggest benefit of retaining that data is that it might help in the future investigation of criminal offences. For example, if someone is a notorious misogynist but has never reached the threshold of criminality, this will help inform the police's lines of inquiry if said person is later a suspect in a violent attack against a woman. As we all know, the justice system is biased very strongly against women committing crimes. And what I did agree with from all the offerings from those in support is that proper oversight is absolutely necessary. And there should be some regulation about this because it does seem ridiculous. Some of the anecdotes that have been mentioned do seem ridiculous. So I still haven't decided if I'd support this, but it would depend on its how it dealt with proper oversight.
My Lords, I wasn't going to speak to this amendment, but like the noble Baroness who spoke before, having listened, I'm so minded. I will study the amendment very carefully, but I do think a balance has to be struck, and that is always most difficult on issues surrounding human rights and freedom of speech. We have to deal with the reality, my Lords, that often hate speech, whether intended as hate speech or not, can incite physical acts of violence. During the pandemic, we have seen, not only around homophobia, and as a gay man I have particular interest in that, but my interest is around all physical hate crimes. But we have seen an enormous rise in physical hate crimes, some of them reported as happening on the crowded underground, happening in domestic situations because of people in much closer quarters than they would otherwise be. So, my Lords, my reason for speaking is just to add a note of caution about how we proceed. I will study this amendment, as I said, in detail, but we must respect that often speech which could be defined as hate speech or perhaps is not, can encourage individuals to take actions against people who they feel should not be within their communities or who do not belong. Thank you, my Lords.
I wanted to support my noble friend Lord Moylan's amendments in this group. Somehow we've ended up in a position where freedom of speech, a precious part of our way of life, has been seriously constrained by something that the police have invented themselves around perceptions of hostility. I find it incomprehensible that the government have allowed the police to carve out this territory unchecked. Why has the College of Policing, a wholly unaccountable body, been allowed to invent a wholly new form of recording of behaviour which by definition is not criminal? And can my noble friend the Minister explain how we got here? My Lord, the recording of non-hate crime incidents is not trivial. It drains police resources from the other things that they should be doing. Reducing knife crime, actually solving crimes rather than recording them, or making women feel safe on our streets are just a few of the things that ordinary people think are more important. Now, as we have heard already, those who have non-crime hate incidents recorded against them are often completely unaware that it has happened, which, if nothing else, is a denial of justice. The information can be kept indefinitely and most generally can be reported to third parties under the Disclosure and Barring Service. This means that the police have created for themselves the ability to wreck people's careers. We live in a society where expression of views which others disagree with is becoming dangerous, and the case of Dr. Kathleen Stock is the latest example of this. Disagreement is too often and too rapidly equated with hate or hostility. And the mere existence of non-crime hate reporting fuels this intolerance. The police are actively encouraging non-crime hate reporting by giving a platform to people who claim to be offended by the views of others. It is a cancer in our society that we should eliminate before it becomes dangerously pervasive. My Lords, Amendment 106 is a complex amendment, and I pay tribute to my noble friend Lord Moylan for his clear introduction of it. I hope that my noble friend the Minister will not hide behind a critique of the amendment, but will engage positively with the substance of the issues that my noble friend and others have raised.
It seems to me, having listened with great interest to what the Baroness Fox read out as to the current guidance given by the College of Policing, seems the very first thing, looking at Lord Cashman's balance, is that that should be scrapped. It seems to me that should not be waiting for the conclusion of this really rather long-winded bill, but that somebody should be getting in touch with the college and either telling them not to give any guidance at all, or getting the government actually to tell them, in the meantime, the sort of guidance that could go forward pending this excellent amendment, which I support.
My Lord. Please.
My Lords, I have not participated in the second reading of this bill, but I did get some correspondence that explained to me what was going on, and I just couldn't believe it. I'm not going to repeat the arguments which have been so eloquently put by Baroness Fox and by the supporters of this motion, but I could not believe it. As an employer, I'm required to do criminal record checks. And if I got a response that said someone was guilty of hate crime, I'm afraid they would go straight in the bin. And yet we discover that people can be put on such a list without their knowledge, as my noble friend Baroness Noakes has said, and also that their name stays there indefinitely, which of course does not apply to people who have actually been convicted of crimes. So they are in the worst of all positions. And then there is the arbitrary nature of it. Now, I wondered how big a problem is this? And I'm told that there have been 119,934 of these by 34 police forces, and that 2,130 of them are children. This is extraordinary that this could be happening, and it is part of a wider concern where our free speech is being undermined. I went on Twitter for, I think I lasted about 3 months. I've spent 40 years offending people and upsetting people by things I've said.
Including your colleagues.
And so far as I know, I'm not on a list as having committed a hate crime. But the essence of our democracy is that there should be free speech, and that our police should be in the business of finding out what the evidence is and not actually turning into the people who conclude and are in effect prosecutors. So I'm not going to detain the House, but I do think some of the examples that have been given of someone who expressed the view that trans women should not have access to women-only spaces. Well, I believe that. Is that a hate crime? Am I not allowed to say that? And the fact that someone could be put on such a list indefinitely, I think, offends against our democracy. So if my noble friend, as I'm sure he will have a brief, because all ministers always do have briefs, that says that the, I beg your pardon, my noble Baroness, I'm sure she'll have her briefs from the Home Office. I worked in the Home Office for a while, and it will say that the amendment is not actually perfectly drafted, and that some provision elsewhere could actually cover this and all the rest. I hope she will throw that away and give an undertaking, not only to bring forward a government amendment, but this very day get onto the police college and end this absolute outrage.
My Lords, forgive me, I think I'm probably quite woke and proud to be so, but nonetheless, I support the broad thrust, I think, of Lord Moylan's amendment, subject to a couple of caveats. Now, the first caveat is a slightly light-hearted one, which is that I gently say to noble lords and friends across the House, as someone who is a serial offender, the overuse of adjectives named for great writers is something that doesn't always help the cause of human rights. We've all done it. Dickensian for socio and economic rights, and Orwellian or even Kafkaesque for civil liberties. In fact, I think an online wit once said of my overuse of these terms, chilling is another one, that Chakrabarti woman finds everything chilling. She sees refrigerators everywhere. But that's just a gentle point about the way we frame this. I do support the broad thrust of this, but my Lords, the problem is not just about allegations of hate. It's a point about soft information, as it's sometimes called, or allegations that are not capable of sustaining a criminal charge, which should not sit on databases for years and years or indefinitely. Now, this is a problem that has been growing for many years with the rise of the database state, or the potential to hold all sorts of data, even if it never matures into a charge, and that is dangerous. In a previous role as the director of liberty, I saw many cases of this kind, and not all of them involving free speech at all. Some involving just citizens who... one woman I remember, whose children... She'd allowed her small children to play in the park whilst she went to a kiosk, and people thought that her children were unattended. She was cautioned by the police, because she was at the borderline, they thought, of neglect. But there was no question of pursuing this as a charge. But nonetheless, this data sat around for years and was hugely detrimental to her when she sought to work in positions of care. So this is not, my Lords, just about the glorious culture wars that have got everyone to their feet today. This is not about whether your views on trans inclusion or not. It is about whether so-called soft information or police intelligence that never matures into a charge should be sitting unregulated off the statute book as a matter of police discretion and administration. And on that procedural point that Lord Moylan was right to make clear, we surely have to agree, whatever our views, on the free speech point. On the free speech point, I would just remind noble lords that free speech is a two-way street. So this is not just about the woke and so-called cancel culture. It is also about protesters who feel that they attend demonstrations and sit on police databases just because they've been caught on CCTV for many years. And I think we would all, in your Lordship's House, do a great service to the nation if, whenever we're considering these so-called culture wars that centre around identity politics and in particular around free speech, we remember it is a two-way street. It's people on either side of very contentious arguments who sometimes want to, quote-unquote, cancel each other, and we should remember that. My final point is a substantive one about how I would urge the noble lady, the Minister, to take this forward. Given that I think the concern, as far as I see it, is not just about the hate incidents, but about all soft information that may be held potentially indefinitely. When the noble lady, the Minister, responds today, or I hope at report, with substantive government safeguards, could they be comprehensive, not just about these non-crime hate incidents, but about all soft intelligence, all police data about individuals that could be to their detriment going forward, whether they touch, of course, on free speech rights, or on other rights, like Article 8 rights to privacy and autonomy or anything else? Can this soft information that's been held administratively by the police beyond the statute book be brought under proper regulation and control?
Well, the issue is a very simple one. We surely have to decide whether the issue of hate crime or non-hate crime and all their different manifestations should be left to police guidance, or whether the issue is far more important than that and should be brought under the process of Parliament, legislative control and legislative process. To me, the answer is perfectly clear. It's the latter.
My Lords, like the noble Lord, I shall attempt to be very brief indeed. My understanding of the law is that it should bring about a degree of certainty in society and a degree of reconciliation. And I fear that the bill, as it currently stands, does neither. In fact, it does the opposite. It has the perverse impact of making division and intolerance more likely, in my view, because it points the finger of accusation at people who have done no wrong. And as such, it seems to me to be an intrusion too far. The perverse consequence of trying to stamp out hate plays into the hands of the oversensitive or the intolerant and actually gives strength to those who want to damage others by making outlandish or indeed even malicious accusations. 2 weeks ago, we stood in this House making tributes to Sir David Amess, and the chamber was filled with voices of alarm that social media and everything else had fueled intolerance and injustice. And these provisions, it seems to me, might well be misused to pour petrol on those flames. The test of innocence until proven guilty is turned on its head. That is unacceptable. And when officialdom is given the power to police the thoughts of the people, it crosses a dangerous line. I've said enough. I said I would be brief, and I'm following in the footsteps of some very powerful speeches, I think. I wholeheartedly support these amendments, and I do hope that the government, my noble friend, is in listening mood on this.
My Lords, I just want to make a point which is not directly related, but I find it quite odd. To give you an example, a few weeks ago I was arrested for speeding, and it was the first time in 40 years that I've actually done anything that is wrong by driving. And what I found really interesting was that in the notice that I received, it clearly said that the past, the fact that I had no other points on my, is irrelevant because it would be unfair to others. So what I don't understand here, if you've been a good guy and you've never done anything wrong, that can't go as a positive, but yet on this bill we are accusing people and making them immediately in the negative, even though we don't have a serious proof of it. So I would also support this amendment.
My Lords, on behalf of these benches, I also support these amendments for all the reasons given by the noble Lords who have moved them. Of course, this amendment, the principal amendment, seeks regulations and it lacks specificity. It doesn't seek to define all the circumstances for retaining, recording, using or disclosing personal data relating to hate crimes or non-hate incident, non-criminal hate incidents or otherwise. But, my Lords, that is sensible, and it is now for the government, I would suggest, to accept the principles that underlie this amendment and come forward with proposals. Of course, I accept the caution which the noble Viscount Lord Hailsham brings to the question of regulations, and they're unamendable, but nevertheless this is a complex area that needs a complex response. What I do suggest is that the principles engaged are important. As the noble Lord Moylan pointed out in opening, this amendment is not concerned with established hate crime, nor is it concerned in any sense with defending hate crime. But it does start from the principle that personal data deserves protection from the arbitrary retention, use and disclosure by the police, by enforcement agencies and by authorities generally. And the converse principle, that disclosure should be subject to the rule of law, subject to principles of accountability, points made by many in this debate, and shortly but eloquently by the noble and learned Lord Judge in his speech a few moments ago. The conduct with which this amendment or these amendments are concerned is not provably, still less proved, criminal. Points made by many. What these amendments seek to control is the arbitrary retention, use and disclosure of personal information based on a subjective perception of a citizen's motivation in the absence of solid evidence or proof, and subjective, one notes, because it's often based on the subjective view of another citizen, no better informed necessarily than the citizen about whom the information is then held. The noble Lord Moylan put it on the basis that the subclause 7 was in a different category from the rest of the clause. For my part, I prefer the way that the noble Lord Sandhurst put it when he set out the principles which underlay the whole of this amendment. My lords, it's not often that I find myself agreeing with almost everybody in the House, including at one and the same time the noble Lord Forsyth of Drumlin and the noble Lady Baroness Chakrabarti. But I do. Even on this occasion, though I understand the hesitations voiced by the noble Lady Baroness Jones of Moulscombe, she too and Lord Cashman accepted the need for regulation in this area. The amendment is directed at achieving sensible limitations on retention, use and disclosure of data to others. It's an area where the government ought to act. It's an area that has become controversial, and become controversial with the emergence of guidelines that are frankly offensive to justice and parliamentary democracy. I therefore invite the Minister, and I believe I speak for the House in inviting the Minister, to return to the House with proposals which accept the principles that we've enunciated and will give rise to amendment of this bill to its vast improvement.
Yeah.
My Lords, as Lord Marks has just said, it is unusual to have such unanimity across the House at committee stage on something which is superficially a very complex matter. And I agree with two noble lords in particular. So firstly, noble Lord Judge, who was very succinct, and where he said the information which the police retain should be subject to parliamentary or government control and not be subject to police guidance. But I also agree with the noble Lord Marks when he is cautious about regulation and there being a full role for Parliament in any rules which are introduced. My Lords, I'm sure this is a very complex matter, and I was just sitting in my seat just now wondering, in my role as a sitting magistrate in London, whether I would see this information. I obviously routinely see the PNC list, the Police National Computer List, which includes convictions, it includes cautions, it includes bail conditions. And if we go ahead and have a bad character application for a trial, we may get additional information disclosed to us, say information to do with allegations of a domestic abuse type nature. And I also was thinking about my role sitting in family court as a magistrate, where I routinely see allegations which have not been substantiated in any court, but have been recorded over many years in social services reports. And I think it's right I should see those allegations when we as a court are making decisions about the way the children should be treated in the context of a family court. So, my lords, I give those two examples which are different to what noble lords have spoken about, and I really give those two examples to, in a way, acknowledge the complexity of the situation with which we are dealing. So I am sympathetic to the points which have been made by the noble lords, but I'm also sympathetic to the government addressing this in an open mind and possibly, well, I'll listen to what the noble lady says with great interest, and whether they propose bringing back any amendments at a later stage of this bill.
My Lords, can I thank all noble lords who've spoken in this debate. It has in fact been a very constructive one. And I thank my noble friend Lord Moylan for tabling the amendments. And I applaud the noble Lord Cashman for promoting the need for balance, and also the noble Lord Ponsonby for his concluding words. My Lords, can I say at the outset that the government does not disagree with my noble friend's view that people should not be inhibited from saying what they think, provided it does not transgress the legal framework which this Parliament has put in place. Noble Lords would all be concerned if the activities of the police were, even if inadvertently and quite possibly for the best of motives, having an adverse effect on particular individuals who had committed no crime. And if that possibility were having a chilling effect, as the noble Lord Panic said, or causing people to temper their quite lawful remarks, that would be a most unsatisfactory state of affairs. So that's my starting point, my Lords. If I could try and set out some of the background to these issues raised by amendments that are before noble Lords. My noble friend Lady Noakes' question was, how have we got here? My Lords, it's a key legacy of the Macpherson inquiry set up to consider the issues surrounding the murder of Stephen Lawrence, and it's intended to give the police the means to understand tensions within communities before they escalate to serious harm. As the name implies, the data pertains to incidents which are not crimes. It can include location data to know where repeat incidents of apparent tension and hostility might occur, for example, outside a place of worship. In this respect, the data is vital for helping the police build intelligence to understand where they must target resources to prevent serious crimes which may later occur. The importance of such intelligence has been illustrated where it could have prevented real harm. The tragic case of Fiona Pilkington and her daughter subjected to persistent hate and abuse, and where the police failed to draw the links of repeated incidents of harassment, is a prime example. Of course, non-crime hate incidents may also include the collection of personal data. Some of these records will have included an accusation of hate crime which has been made against a person but was not proven. And I know that there's been concern that such data might appear in enhanced criminal records checks which are required for jobs such as working with children and vulnerable adults, and that a person could be inappropriately disadvantaged for expressing a sentiment which is in no way criminal. Precisely to guard against that possibility, the disclosure of non-conviction data in such checks is covered by statutory guidance issued by the Home Office to Chief Officers of Police. It makes it clear that the police should disclose such information only after careful consideration and when it is proportionate and relevant to the job in question. Data of this kind can only be disclosed on the say-so of a senior officer, who should also consider whether the individual concerned should be given the opportunity to make the case that the information is not shared. Individuals also have the right to request an independent monitor to carry out the review of whether information is relevant to the role for which they are applying. In practice, it's rare for the police to disclose non-conviction information of any kind. Only 0.1% of enhanced certificates include such information in 1919-20. But I fully understand that the public is concerned with how the collection of non-crime hate incident data might infringe fundamental liberties, particularly free expression, and may harm a person's future prospects. But I don't think it's as simple as saying that the issue could be resolved with the introduction of more stringent regulations governing the process and disclosure of data. I think what we need to do, my lords, is avoid unintended consequences through any reform of this practice. Firstly, we need to ensure that we don't tie the hands of police in collecting the non-personal location data which I describe and which can be vital in building an understanding of hotspots where serious harm might occur. Back to the Noble Lord Cashman's point about balance. Secondly, my lords, it's important to remember that the process of determining whether a crime has occurred is not always linear or indeed simple. While the law on hate crime is clear, the process of determining whether an offence was committed may not be. The use of non-crime incident recording can exist in the grey space between the police making initial inquiries and making records such as this, and a decision to take no further action due to the lack of evidence or where a suspect cannot be identified. Non-crime hate incident records often form part of the normal record keeping of early criminal investigations. The data recorded may prove material to establishing a pattern of conduct when an investigation is reopened or where further criminal complaints are made. Simply put, suggesting a clear dividing line between work to tackle crime on the one hand and this form of data collection on the other isn't entirely accurate. The data is part and parcel of crime prevention. It must, however, be fair and proportionate to the harm that it's seeking to avoid. The public must also have faith that it does no more than strictly necessary to tackle this harm and preserves free speech. I set this out, my lords, to make clear that this is not a simple issue, as the Noble Lord Ponsonby said, or one that can be solved by just the stroke of a pen. But as I said at the start of my remarks, the government does have considerable sympathy for the intention behind my noble friend's amendment. To address the noble Lady Butler-Sloss's question and to agree with my noble friend Lord Forsyth of Drumleen, it was for this purpose earlier this year that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, wrote to the then acting Chief Executive Officer of the College of Policing and to the relevant lead within the National Police Chiefs Council to ask them to explore this further and consider whether there are realistic and credible options for reforming non-crime hate incidents to improve personal data protections for those connected with incidents that don't lead to a criminal charge. And I'm happy to say, my lords, that the College of Policing has given this issue serious consideration and come up with some suggestions which the government are now considering. The College has also pointed out that there is ongoing litigation which is very pertinent to this issue. Accordingly, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to set out a definitive position on what happens next. To all noble lords, I say wait and see. We will need to see how the litigation pans out and we will need to engage in ongoing dialogue with the College of Policing.
Allow me.
Yes, I will do.
Thank you. I'm not a lawyer, but could you just explain why she thinks this is a matter for the College of Policing and not for Parliament and the government?
I am simply pointing out that the Home Secretary has been in touch with the College of Policing to see if this if this issue can be improved and reformed further. So what I was going to finish saying is let's count nothing in, nothing out, and I hope that both my noble friend and the noble Lord Forsyth of Drumleen will take comfort by the fact that my the Right Honourable Friend, the Home Secretary, has actually identified a problem for which she is seeking a solution. There'll be more to be said in the coming months, but I hope that for now I've said enough to reassure my noble friend that he will see fit to withdraw his amendment.
My Lords, my noble friend said, invited the House to wait and see. Could you give us some idea, could you give the House some idea of how long that wait might be?
Well, I can certainly promise my noble friend and noble lords have been involved in the debate this afternoon that I will go back and see if I can put a time frame on it.
My Lords, when I tabled these amendments, I had no idea that they would find, first of all, universal approbation in all parts of the House, nor secondly, that they would attract the support of so many very distinguished legal figures. It's quite humbling to list and look at. I mean, I may have missed some, but Lord Sandhurst, the noble Lord, my noble friend Lord Sandhurst, the noble Lord Panic, the noble and learned Lord Judge, the noble Lord Viscount Hailsham, the noble and learned Lady Butler Sloss, all of them highly distinguished figures in the law, in one department of the law or another, and indeed I may have missed some speakers whose careers I'm not equally familiar with. And they all, I think, united on a fairly straightforward point, well, 2 points. First of all, that the operation of the current system of recording can cause genuine harm unjustly to particular individuals, and secondly, that this process should be subject to statutory supervision and to parliamentary supervision. And really that is the essence of the entire case for supporting these amendments. Of course, there were many speeches for which I'm grateful, and I don't think I really have time to thank everybody, but it was an excellent debate. Many speeches made by people who don't have, such as myself, who don't have pretensions to any legal expertise, such as the noble Lady Fox of Buckley, and the noble Lady Noakes, my noble friend Lord Forsyth of Drumlean, noble Baroness Lady Chakrabarty, my noble friend Lord Dobbs, and so forth. Lord Dobbs, but did I make a mistake there? Sorry. But I'm very grateful to everyone who has spoken. I particularly want to draw attention to the remarks made by the noble Baroness Lady Jones of Mulscombe and the noble Lord Cashman. They have both made a very important point, which is that it can be useful to the police in preventing crime in the future to have access to this information and, in certain cases, to retain it. I do not pretend, my lords, that the drafting of the regulations envisaged by these amendments is going to be simple. It will have to take account of the points made by the noble Baroness and the noble Lord. They are important points, but these amendments do not prejudge the weight to be given to those various factors when the government comes to draw up the guidance envisaged. So I'm very sympathetic to the points they made. I'd like to give everybody a gold star for their speeches, except possibly to my noble friend on the front bench, who sadly, and it's a matter of bitter regret to me, it goes to my heart, but she did struggle, and my noble friend Lord Forsyth of Drumlean put his finger on this. She did struggle to explain, and I don't think she even really attempted to explain, why these provisions should not be the subject of statutory supervision. She gave, if I can pick up a couple of points, she gave an example of harassment of an individual as to why this information should be retained. My Lords, in my explanation of the amendment, I tried to point out that it wouldn't affect harassment of individual cases. But if my noble friend on the front bench feels that it isn't sufficiently clear in the amendment that that is the case, I would, of course, be very happy to accept further amendments from the government that would make it abundantly clear. So I hope that deals with one of the points that she made. She also said, and this is always an argument for doing nothing, that we must beware of unintended consequences of more stringent regulation. My Lords, we haven't asked for more stringent regulation, or indeed for less stringent regulation. We have simply asked for proper regulation by properly constituted bodies, and we're leaving it very much in the hands of the Home Office and my noble friend to come forward with something that they think appropriate. But I am very encouraged, if I can give some consolation to my noble friend, I am very encouraged by her remark that her colleague, the Home Secretary, does recognise that there is a problem and that some indication of some possibility of action was implied by that. So, taking heart from that comment, I beg leave to withdraw the amendments.
Is it your Lordship's pleasure that the amendment be withdrawn? The amendment is by leave withdrawn. Amendment 106A was debated, not moved. Amendment 107 in Schedule 3, Amendment 107 was debated, not moved. And Schedule 3, Amendments 108 and 109, government amendments formally. Question: these two amendments be agreed to. May that be say content. Contrary not content, the content schedule. Schedule 3, the question is Schedule 3 be the third schedule to the bill. May that be say content. Contrary not content, the contents of it. In clause study 43, question is clause 43 stand part of the bill. May that be say content. Contrary not content, contents of it. After clause 43, Amendment 110, Bishop Gloucester.
My Lords, I'm pleased to introduce a